Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream with my special guest, Rupert August, on the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty, 1902 to 1922. Make sure that the sound on this is going to be okay. Done. As always, I'm going to play us in with a bit of a tune, although this one's a bit different from some of the tunes that I play, shall we say.
Good place to start would be the fact that that song seems quite unlike a lot of the other Imperial Japanese military music I've heard. Admittedly, mostly army, but makes me wonder if that's some kind of indication of the more westernized nature of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Yes, I think it probably is. It was less easy to directly go from being samurai to being a modern naval fleet to changing the army.
Well, it might have been if they actually had a naval tradition to speak of.
Yes. And also, of course, I was just going to say that march, the warship march, which was the official march of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it's still the official march of the Japanese Naval Maritime Self-Defense Force, which is once again becoming a powerful regional navy, unlike the Royal Navy in Britain, which of course has never been weaker than it is today.
Yeah, I mean, there's a surprising amount of continuity in places between pre and post 1945 Japan.
Yeah. The Japanese warship names are pretty much the same, and they now have 2 aircraft carriers for the first time since World War II. So yeah, Rupert probably doesn't need any introduction. He's been on streams with me quite a few times, and I would also strongly suggest, if you're watching this stream, you go and check the stream he did with Semi-Agog about Japanese intelligence. Basically, from when did you do it? From the 1860s right up until World War II, I think, wasn't it, Rupert? Pretty much.
Yeah, from the Meiji Restoration until roughly somewhere in World War. Yeah, we touched a little bit on like the end of World War II, but yeah, mostly up to the war, really.
Yeah, that was a really interesting stream, and it was partly the inspiration for this one. Although I've wanted to do something on the Anglo-Japanese Alliance for quite a long time now. But Rupert is very up on the diplomatic and political side of this stuff, and also the Japanese side of it. And so hopefully he's going to be able to carry me a bit on that stuff, and I'll deal mainly with the naval and military side of it from the British point of view. So
yeah, I'm mostly in the space of reading about the Japanese side of things. So hopefully our knowledge will be able to dovetail quite nicely.
Yeah, I'm trying to build up my knowledge on the Japanese, but I don't pretend to know as much as you do by any means. So would you like to maybe set the scene a little bit for people who don't know anything about this stuff, Rupert, in the let's say from about the 1890s, because the Anglo-Japanese Alliance was talked about from sort of around the middle of the 1890s.
The place that I wanted to start is actually a little bit earlier, because
sure.
During the early stage of the opening up of Japan, you get you get a couple of instances, like a couple of slights by various Western powers when they're sort of trying to flex their muscles and enforce various unequal treaties and such. And the British actually take part in that. I can't remember what the incident is actually called, but there was a slight against a number of, I believe it was merchants, British merchants who had been trailblazing in regards to opening up Japan for Western commerce. And
the Royal Navy bombarded a Japanese port and then landed
exactly.
Royal Marines who captured a Japanese battery, I believe.
Yes, indeed. As you might imagine, this does not necessarily put the British in very good stead, but they managed to quickly repair their reputation somewhat by backing the correct side of the subsequent Boshin War between the shogunate forces and the incumbent shogunate forces and the rising star Emperor Meiji and his supporters.
Yes, I mean, one of the things, a lot of people will have watched that film, The Last Samurai, for example, which has a lot of mistakes in it. And one of the mistakes they make is that most of the initial Japanese military reforms were actually mainly pushed by the French. In fact, the Japanese even adopted some French bits of uniform, etc., like French knots on officers' sleeves and this kind of stuff. Whereas the Navy was originally French, but the Japanese quickly found that the French idea of naval warfare would not suit them, and switched over to the British.
Yeah, it's quite funny, really. Basically, what they did when they were looking around for modernization. How to modernize and basically how to catch up with the West. They just saw, okay, who's doing the best at all these different things, and then we'll just copy them. So they get a bit of a weird hodgepodge in places. But it's during this exact period of modernization that the French go from the preeminent land power, in particular, to being the second-rate one behind Germany, and so they have an abrupt shift in this entire period. And so they start off reforming their army along French lines, but then they switch over to Germany partway through.
Yeah, 100%. And as I said, the same thing happens with their naval forces. They go from following the French idea. And it was really something you talked about on the Semi-Agog stream, Rupert. You talked about the first Japanese-China War.
Yeah.
And it was that decided the Japanese naval commanders that, hang on, no. This idea of not having big battleships, etc., which was the French idea, wasn't going to cut it for Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, they decided to go for a much more sort of conventional navy and try to build one along the same kinds of lines as the British. And so subsequently, there's kind of like as well as the fact that again the British backed the Imperial side of the Boshin War. They were the primary influence for the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had especially by the time I guess it doesn't really make much difference by the time you get to 1905 because the alliance has already happened by that point. But even before then, they had a good number of successes under their belt to give themselves a good amount of legitimacy.
Yes, they were a very efficient navy.
I believe,
especially as they were so young, they were a very efficient navy, well disciplined as you might expect of Japanese dudes.
Yeah, there was a particular battle in the Boshin War. I can't remember what it was called. Unfortunately, I can't remember some of the stuff off the top of my head. But towards the end, where they were basically just mopping up shogunate resistance in the north. And up on the island of Hokkaido, to the north of the Japanese mainland, there was like a breakaway republic. Funnily enough, that was also supported by a Frenchman who was actually brought into government, and I think he was the inspiration for Tom Cruise's character in The Last Samurai. Seeing as we're talking about that, but yeah, that's just a side point. Essentially, there was a naval battle to obviously be able to make the crossing, and the budding Imperial Japanese Navy fared very well there, and was able to ensure the success of the reunification of Japan. So quite an important political move to have that under their belt. And again, already being reformed along British Navy lines, so it puts the Navy and the British in very good stead. But on top of that, there's also quite a lot of the industrialization and more of the civil stuff that's happening along British lines as well that is quite influential. So I think in particular they're importing a lot of I think it's electronics they get a lot of from Britain, because Britain was doing quite well in terms of innovation in that space at the time. But in particular, they use the same railway gauge as well, and import a lot of British railway, equipment and innovations and such, and base a lot of their railway along British lines, I believe.
Yep, absolutely. There was a Scotsman, I'm trying to remember his name, who was quite important. He was given a high medal by the Emperor Meiji. Of course, he was a Scotsman because he was an engineer of some description, I believe. I'm trying to remember his name now. I only read about him today.
I'm not familiar with the story, so unfortunately you're on your own on that one.
All right, I will see if I can look him up. You carry on, because what you're talking about is very interesting.
Yeah. So in this environment of sort of like harmonizing interests, or harmonizing interests, but also sort of harmonizing ways of doing things, and commercial networks and all that kind of thing. Being that, well, two things are happening. Britain is looking to try to reduce the cost of its various global commitments, because by this point, Britain is very well established as a very global power, and is trying to find ways of reducing the cost of actually maintaining all of that, because it takes a very extensive amount of military investiture in order to, and garrison and everything, in order to be able to secure everything that they're trying to keep hold of. So they see the opportunity in Japan of being able to basically allow a reduction in the cost of garrisoning their Far East and Pacific possessions. And on top of that, they're also hedging against Russia, who is one of their main enemies at the moment. So in particular, in the late 19th century, the Russians are one of the main powers that are trying to shake up the status quo in China, which Britain is quite content to keep the status quo as is, because they have more or less dominance over a lot of the markets, and they've got a lot of concessions which allow them to corner quite a lot of the Chinese market in terms of acquiring what they want, and exercising power over the commerce that's flowing in and out of China. Russia is trying to split everything up into spheres of influence, which would be much more advantageous to them, because they have designs on Manchuria in particular, and potentially even more than that. Tibet, I think, is also talked about, and potentially more than that once they have all of that locked down. But Japan is one of the main powers who sees China as its very vital backyard, and so the interests sort of coincide there. Obviously, Japan later goes on to be a power who is themselves trying to carve out spheres of influence in China and fuse China purely as its own domain. But early on, they can both get on board with the idea that they don't want Russia making more inroads into China, and so there's like a mutual rivalry that is able to bring them closer together as well.
Yeah, I mean, from Britain's point of view, yeah, absolutely. It was aimed at Russia, which,
I wouldn't
as you say,
necessarily, but it's definitely a factor.
It was mainly aimed at Russia. I mean, it was aimed at anyone in the Far East, to be honest, because it enabled the Royal Navy to cut down the number of big warships that it kept in the Far East permanently. Because the Japanese Navy would be an ally, but it was certainly aimed at Russia in the sense that both Britain and Japan were, for different reasons, anti-Russian basically at that time.
Yeah.
And it was quite a good treaty, I think, because one of its provisions was that if there were just two parties at war, so if Britain went into a war with another country or Japan went into a war with another country, I mean, obviously the obvious example is the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. That did not require the other party of the alliance to intervene. They would only do so if another country joined against the original. So as we were talking about before we started, if France had decided to back Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, then Britain would have intervened, and that would have been a very, very sad day for the Russian and French navies. But they didn't need to. Whereas if more countries were involved, so as for example in the First World War, Japan did join that war because obviously Britain wasn't just fighting Germany, they were fighting Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, and later on Bulgaria. So, it was quite a sensible war. Quite a sensible treaty from that point of view. And part of the reason for that is that the Japanese were not keen to get involved in the area around India, which of course was vital for the British in those days. Whereas the British didn't really want to get involved in Korea, which was becoming increasingly vital for the Japanese.
Yeah. Although it is worth noting that after the first Sino-Japanese War, when China was forced to hand over concessions in the Liaodong Peninsula, I think it is, the one where Port Arthur was ultimately set up, that was originally going to be handed over as Kwantung, I believe, to Japan, but Russia is obviously the main party that is instigating a walkback of some of those treaties, and like an international conference to determine what is acceptable for Japan to be gaining from that war. And one of the things, so Russia is putting those is kind of like the main instigator behind that, but they bring in France and also Britain into that. So again, it comes back to this idea of, I suppose. I don't know how far you can take that observation, but it's certainly interesting that even at that stage, Britain was willing to play along with like an anti-Japanese policy.
Where I think that changed from Britain's point of view was during the Boxer Rebellion in China, when obviously Russia didn't act well. I mean, Russia did fight against the Boxers, but they also used it as an excuse to move a lot more troops into Manchuria, etc. Whereas Japan and Britain cooperated quite efficiently. Both had quite large land forces and naval forces involved in ending the Boxer Rebellion, and they actually worked together very well in 1900 during that rebellion in China. And I think that was the tipping point, really, for the British.
That also raises an interesting point, though, because what we haven't discussed yet is from the Japanese perspective, what they were, the main thing that they were getting out of it. So in exchange for, tacitly agreeing to protect Britain's possessions in the Far East, Japan was getting international recognition. So ever since the experience of the Boshin War and the pre-Meiji Restoration and the unequal treaties and all that kind of stuff, they were very much working towards this idea that they would avoid the fate of China and not simply be the field upon which the great powers would compete and like partition and decide how spheres of influence were to be allocated, but instead that they would be a power in and of themselves, and so they struggled for recognition of that fact, like right the way through to 1902 and even beyond. And so that's essentially one of the main things that Japan is getting out of it, is that once they have a proper European-style alliance with a European power, and the preeminent European power at that, then they can be content, not only in terms of like a national consciousness kind of sense, but it's almost like like an inferiority complex that is broken by that, and that's it. It doesn't sound like much, but I think it's quite significant in.
Absolutely. As we were saying before we started, Rupert, the Anglo-Japanese Alliance was the first equal treaty between a Western power and an Eastern power.
Yeah. So in that context, I think it is quite interesting the point about the Boxer Rebellion that you bring up, because that is a case where Japan is demonstrating that it's willing to work on the same terms as the European powers, and it's willing to uphold their version of what the international order is going to be. Their version of international law. Therefore, it legitimizes Japan as a player that can be negotiated with as a European style power.
Yeah, they could be they're treated as a grown up, full diplomatic and military power for the first time.
Yeah, unlike China in that situation, who at one point had been treading the same kind of path of Westernization, but then at this critical juncture had, probably from the European perspective, thrown their toys out of the pram and started having a tantrum, and have to be taught about, how things are going to happen, basically. What the situation is going to be.
Well, I tell you, I watched that excellent stream you did with Semi-Agog, Rupert, and like you were talking about the naval actions in the Japanese-China War, and one of the things I wanted to say if I'd have been on that stream would have been that the two most powerful Chinese battleships at the Yellow River, I think it was Yellow River, the main battle in the Japanese-China War, their shells were filled with were filled with like clay and stuff rather than explosives, because the explosive had been sold due to corruption.
That's not an anecdote I've heard, but certainly helps a lot of things slot into context.
Yeah, naval history is my deal, and so I've watched loads of naval history channels. I read loads of naval history books, and that's quite well attested that they had shells that were not filled with explosives. Some of their best guns, because the guys in charge had sold them.
Ouch.
Which was something the Japanese didn't generally have the problem with.
Yeah. But I mean, just to sort of fill in the rest of the context that I added then, to not rely on having heard that other stream, the Japanese were able to. The best reason that I've come across as to the strategy that Japan was using to win in this war basically is. I don't think Russia did control Alaska at that time. I think
I was just going to say, wasn't it the 1860s that they sold Alaska? I believe.
I can't check right now, but I think so.
I think it was like something like 1867, somewhere around there. Pretty sure that's the case, John Best. That's the reason I put it up, Rupert.
Yeah, but anyway, the Japanese were able to use a greater unity of command to use their numerically inferior naval forces to exercise tactical, like local superiority of numbers and superiority of firepower in order to just sort of break up the Chinese fleet piecemeal, and thus kind of make them, more or less helpless to whatever the Japanese wanted to do. And then the reason why that seems to have happened is, maybe there was some wrangling by the Japanese secret services and whatever, and all of their various intelligence operatives on the ground. I'm sure that did play in, because they were very good at leaning on influential people who they targeted, to sort of like find the weak spot and then exploit their vices and things like that. Whereas on the the more agnostic side to that would be that the Chinese had not fully exited this quite corrupt Qing era, very court politics focused mindset of governors basically refusing to help one another, even though they know that they could, that if they banded together, they could actually win for China and beat the Japanese probably quite easily, accepting the kind of corruption that you talked about with the lack of explosives and things like that. So, if you're just going numerically, then they could have won, but too much is getting in the way. Like, this governor slighted me during a tea ceremony, therefore I'm gonna leave him to die, kind of thing.
China was like very decentralized. I mean, you carried right on into the warlord era in between the two world wars, and the well-known Sino-Japanese War. It was very decentralized. The central government only had so much power, and it really didn't change until after the communists took over, I guess.
Well, funnily enough, I've heard that it never really went away, and that regional governors still have quite a significant amount of power that's not properly appreciated, because it's obviously in everyone's political best interest to just pretend that the central government's in control.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. Doesn't surprise me, but interesting. But yeah, but I mean, that was the big advantage the Japanese had. They had a very centralized, quite efficient, bureaucratically run state fairly quickly.
Yeah, and basically everybody was already on side. They'd already had their civil war. They'd sorted out a lot of those problems and schisms, and sort of got on with it, reforming from there.
Yeah, no, absolutely makes sense. Britain, of course, was also not only Britain was helping train once the alliance came in fact, even before the alliance came into effect, Britain was helping to train Japanese naval officers. Japanese naval officers went across to the UK, were taken around like warship manufacturers, gun manufacturers, places like the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and all this kind of stuff.
I should add, both officially and unofficially that happened.
Yes, absolutely. And so the Japanese kind of liked this stuff. They liked the cult of Nelson and all this kind of story. If you look, you'll know more about this than me, probably, Rupert. The Japanese admiral at Tsushima in 1904, he's very much the Japanese Nelson.
I can't remember who that was, actually. So you might know more about that than I do.
Yeah, the admiral there was he was very much the Japanese Nelson, and he even flew a similar signal to England expects at the Battle of Tsushima, which of course was when the Japanese crushed the Russian Baltic fleet, which had sailed all the way around the world to try and relieve the Japanese garrison at the Russian garrison at Port Arthur.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out on Semi-Agog stream, almost got into a war with the Royal Navy in the North Sea because they opened fire on a load of British trawlers, thinking they could be Japanese destroyers. Although how Japanese torpedo boats in those days, how Japanese torpedo boats could possibly have arrived in the North Sea is beyond imagining, basically.
Well, at this point, to sort of steel man the position, the Russian position in this context, because I have been sort of brought around a little bit on this idea from just thinking, what the hell were they thinking? It must have been idiots. By this point, the Anglo-Japanese alliance is already in effect. So in theory, they could make use of British ports, conceivably.
Not officially under the alliance.
Yeah, I know it's not explicit, but in terms of the idea of having ships in your allies' port and then launch from there, either officially or unofficially, is not beyond the realms of possibility.
What was more useful for the Japanese, I think, and more likely, of course, and it did happen, was that they were getting intelligence from the British.
Yes,
Britain was getting some signals intelligence from the Russian fleet, etc., and we were passing some of that at least on to the Japanese.
Not only that, but the Russians themselves, as I mentioned in Semi-Agog stream, were receiving intelligence from various operatives around Europe, and in particular, there was a particular Spanish smuggler who. Oh,
your Spanish smugglers! I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah. who had actually fed information to a couple of Russian officers that there were definitely Japanese torpedo boats in the area and to be on the lookout for them. So they were actively expecting there to be some kind of attack by Japanese torpedo boats, and then in the middle of the fog, they spot these boats, fishing trawlers, when they're already on the lookout, when they're already jumpy,
and it was night time as well.
Yeah, in roughly the place and time that they were expecting to be attacked by torpedo boats. Yeah, I think it's more reasonable in that context, but it changes.
Well, they got shadowed. They got shadowed by a Royal Navy fleet under Lord Charles Beresford.
Yeah.
And Lord Charles Beresford was a very aggressive admiral, and he was just waiting for the slightest order to sink the Russians, and they would have absolutely sunk the Russian fleet easily. The Japanese sank it fairly easily, and the Royal Navy would have done so even more easily because they had more ships and more experience.
But knowing that the Russians were fed false information, that does lead me towards thinking that there was, some kind of intent to. I mean, that just adds an extra layer of the British just being ready to attack their erstwhile enemy whilst it's basically helpless and get involved in the war more directly. But
Britain was constantly worried. Britain was constantly worried at this stage, not only about Russian infiltration into China, particularly into Manchuria, but also about the Russian threat to the northwest frontier of India. Which would have meant them marching through Afghanistan, which we all know now, after many subsequent wars, would have been no very easy thing to do. But it would have been theoretically maybe possible. And Britain was always concerned about that. And given that the Japanese had already defeated the Russian Pacific Fleet, and the Black Sea Fleet really couldn't go anywhere because, if it got out of the Black Sea, it was only going to meet the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. So that fleet wasn't able to go anywhere. And the Baltic Fleet was the last hope the Russians had. And I don't think it would have taken all that much for the Royal Navy officers rather than the politicians to have turned around and said, yeah, all right, we'll sink these boats, And of course, that would have just made Japan's life even easier. So... Although, as you rightly pointed out on Temugog Stream, the Japanese army actually had a very hard fight at Port Arthur.
Well, not just at Port Arthur, but even across Manchuria itself.
The
Russians actually acquitted themselves incredibly well and took quite a few correct lessons from the war, which, I suppose ironically in some ways they get misapplied to World War One. Because one of the things that they learn is the invaluability, just how amazingly good the machine gun is, contrary to many expectations who thought it would just be...
And artillery and trenches and barbed wire and all the stuff that was used in the First World War was pretty well used at Port Arthur and in Manchuria.
Exactly, but especially the machine gun. And so just looking forwards, in 1914, it ends up being the case that the Russians are overly cautious with a lot of their machine guns, and especially when they're on the offensive, they refuse to move them up sufficiently to put them in harm's way. And the troops that are operating them are some of the best that they can get are applied to machine gun detachments, and so it means that not only do you lose some of your best troops not able to take part in the battle, but everyone's sort of so petrified about the idea of losing these invaluable machine guns that they don't actually get used.
Yeah, and like all weapons are useless if you don't use them.
Yes, exactly.
One of the great things about the Royal Navy is the Royal Navy's always realised that warships are weapons, and if you don't ever risk them, they can't do their job, which is why Royal Navy warships sometimes get sunk but always get used.
Yeah.
Which is another thing the Japanese learned, although they had their own naval doctrines, which were later on, which were not the same as the Royal Navy's. They didn't work out so well for them.
Should we actually talk about the treaty itself then? We sort of skipped ahead.
Yeah. Well, obviously, it was in 1902. It was the first treaty that broke Britain's splendid isolation, which is what my streams are named after. It was the only treaty that the Conservatives did, rather than the Liberals. I don't think we actually said this on the stream. But I mean, unlike the Entente with France and then the later Entente with the Russians, it had no secret clauses. It didn't have stuff that not even Parliament or even a lot of the governing party knew about, which the Entente, you can't call them treaties, but they really were, had. And unlike the ones with France and Russia, didn't drag Britain into World War One, which I always think is an enormous advantage myself. I think it was a treaty which was a good treaty for Britain. The Japanese proved absolutely loyal allies for the 20 years that it ran. They were deeply upset when it was ended, but I will come on to that in a bit, I suppose. And Britain paid for that. So yeah, I think it was actually a good treaty for Britain, particularly in the way that it didn't demand that either side go into any war the other side got into, if it was only with one other nation, which was caution on the part of both Britain and Japan.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I'd add is that, so you mentioned that there were no secret clauses or anything like that, and I think that makes sense in the context of it being fairly straightforward what both parties want out of it, especially in terms of Japan. So there's no additional sort of like dirty little clauses that need to be added just so that, you know, just to sweeten the deal for one side or the other, because quite simply Japan is looking for recognition, and Britain just wants, you know, doesn't have any particular target in mind necessarily, other than perhaps Russia, but even then, neither power is actually going out of their way to change their own policy on Russia. It's an acknowledgement of what their foreign policy is towards Russia as is. So there's no additional clauses that need to be set aside for that. So yeah, it can be quite simple, because what both parties want out of it is itself very simple.
Yes. I absolutely. And of course, if you look at Britain and Japan, although we're on opposite sides of the world, they're actually in many respects quite similar nations. They're both island peoples. The Japanese were trying to develop an empire at this stage, and the British already had the world's biggest empire, obviously. They were both nations that to some degree relied on trade and, you know, merchant shipping and so on. So they had quite a lot in common.
And although Japan didn't have much of a naval tradition at this point, it was fairly young, but they were still sort of aspirationally moving in that direction and took a lot of pride in their navy. And so in that sense, they were both quite navally focused.
Oh yeah, 100. I mean, look, people these days in Britain even don't realise how important the Royal Navy used to be, even in World War II. To the British, it was by far the most important service, by a long way, vastly more important than the Army or the RAF. And people just don't understand that anymore, because the Royal Navy these days is so pathetically weak and small. I mean, even at the time of the Falklands War in 1982, the Royal Navy had 70 frigates and destroyers. And today we have 17, I think. It's either 16 or 17. And the Japanese Navy has more than that, by the way, these days.
Yeah, they're actually surprisingly one of the big players. You don't necessarily think about them, especially in terms of naval affairs. Makes a lot of sense, but Japan has quite successfully cultivated this more recent international image, I guess, of being quite peaceful and not really interfering too much.
Bjarke, I've got to push back against your point here. Japan didn't want Australia, certainly not in 1902, certainly not any time between 1902 and 1922. And patriotic Australian prime ministers were very clear that they liked the Anglo-Japanese Naval Agreement, because it did protect Japan, did protect Australia. And in World War One, Japanese warships actually escorted Australian and New Zealand soldiers to the Middle East.
Not only that, but as late as I think it was 1921, was it the Imperial Conference? one of the Imperial conferences, or it might have been
Yeah,
might have been
21, 22, somewhere around there. Yes, for sure.
and they had broad agreement on the idea of maintaining the alliance with Japan, like all the dominions did, with the exception of Canada. Canada was the only country that was
and they were obviously heavily leaned on by the Americans for obvious reasons.
Yeah, not only leaned on, but perhaps you could also say legitimately worried about the prospect of having a hostile southern border, being that for them it would be almost completely indefensible.
Well, I actually wanted to speak about that a bit because in the early 1920s, Britain had two possible enemies. One was Japan, the other was America.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
for the same reason, it was the Washington Naval Treaty. But anyway, I mean, Billy Hughes, for example, who's one of the outstanding nationalist Australian prime ministers, he was fully in favour of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance because he knew if there wasn't an alliance between Britain and the Empire and Japan, then Japan was going to become a potential enemy. And there was no way Australia could spend enough money to counterbalance the Japanese fleet.
But fundamentally, they were essentially forced to pick a side in the Pacific theater because both Japan and America had for quite a while realized that they were going to come into conflict with one another. And so when that conflict became acute enough, they just sort of had to pick a side, and they chose Anglo Brotherhood over, perhaps you could say, over geopolitical expediency, for better or worse.
Well, are you saying, Rupert, that the British chose that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that, to be honest with you. I think that some of the politicians did, sure, but the Navy didn't.
Well,
the Navy was much more sensible. I mean, the thing is, first of all, with the Washington Naval Treaty, which is a bit of an aside, but I suppose we have to talk about it, it reduced the Royal Navy from vastly bigger than the American Navy to about the same size. Slightly bigger, but not much. And once you have that agreement, the Americans put enormous pressure on Britain to get rid of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance because if Britain and Japan were still allied, between us, we would vastly outnumber the American fleet.
Yeah.
Simple as that. That was the only reason. And I would have been... the Brotherhood story would have made some sense if the Americans had said, okay, well, you get rid of the Japanese alliance and we'll give you an alliance with the Americans. But of course, they didn't do that. In fact, they still kept up War Plan Orange, which was their attack on the British Empire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the hope was that the Americans would forgive some of the war debt, but then when that actually came up quite shortly after the annulment of the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, or alliance rather, they were offended that we'd even ask. So,
yeah, and Britain was also a debtor nation. Britain was also a creditor nation after World War I, and most people didn't pay us back. And the Americans moaned about the British not paying them back all the money, but loads of people didn't pay Britain back. It happened all over the place in World War I. Now, look, as you probably know, Rupert, I think World War I was like the original sin of Britain and the Empire, getting involved in it, and especially raising a mass land army. So I'm not going to try and make some excuse for World War I, but at the end of it, most nations were in the same position. The Americans were just in the lucky position is they hadn't lost many troops because not many of their troops arrived in France in time to fight. In fact, most of the troops who did arrive in France never fought from America. And the war was basically fought and won by the French and the British, and in the end, mostly by the British, because the French army mutinied in 1917 and had to be handled very, very carefully after that.
Yeah. Pretty much had an almost entirely defensive posture after the Nivelle offensives, I believe, and the mutinies.
Yes, 100%. Whereas the Japanese alliance was wholly helpful to Britain. They took out the main German colonies in the Far East, or helped the British and Australians to take them out. They hunted the German East Asia Squadron, which was eventually killed by the Brits off the Falkland Islands. after inflicting a defeat on the Royal Navy that was mainly caused by idiot orders from Winston Churchill. They also, as I said earlier, escorted Australian and New Zealand soldiers to the Middle East. And eventually, they even sent destroyer squadrons into the Mediterranean to help the Royal Navy in World War I. This is the Japanese.
Yeah, they did also mop up the German presence in East Asia more generally. So took over all of their colonies and seized all of the garrisons and all that kind of thing as well. So
and interestingly,
turned Far East into a friendly lake, basically.
Yeah, it was an allied lake. And interestingly, the Japanese treated those German prisoners from World War I very well. They were all treated according to the Geneva Convention and went home, in many cases, fitter than when they were taken prisoner.
Well, this is the thing about this kind of period is it's worth getting into the details of what kind of factional forces were at play, because famously the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army both have an almost unprecedented, by great power standards at the time, autonomy to determine their own conduct, and
they hated each other.
Not only did they hate each other, but there were also factions within them that hated one another. So especially in the Imperial Japanese Army, there were a lot of much more radical factions that were to some extent tolerated, and to a greater extent just sort of couldn't be dealt with necessarily until the late 30s, and that sort of started to get everyone on the same kind of page. But in this earlier stage, especially, you have a preponderance of figures, especially in the Imperial Japanese Navy, who are very pro-Western, pro-British especially, and they are much more of the view that Japan should be taking a fairly moderate course and playing according to the international diplomatic rules. What happens, and I'm sure this is part of what factors into to why they were so much more, their conduct was so much more better at this stage, is because you have these kind of more liberal figures who are currently in the ascendant because they're being proven right by their treatment on the international stage.
Yeah,
with things like
absolutely.
especially the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. But the problem comes in a bit later.
It gave Japan, or the people who supported it in Japan, quite a lot of legitimacy, I suppose you could say.
Yes, because you can, because you have figures on the inside, both in political parties and secret societies, and also in these armed forces factions. Some of which are saying, Japan above all. The Westerners are not like us. They are, fundamentally different and eternally predatory, something like that, or just Japanese ultranationalists who are incredibly chauvinistic and demeaning to every other power for its own sake, for racial reasons or whatever. And then you have other factions that are a little bit more on the side of, playing nice and trying to become a European-style power and respected in that sort of club, but will otherwise very much buy into a lot of the liberal propaganda. Because, again, bearing in mind these people they're modernizing, and so they're looking around. By this point they've basically already modernized, but during that period of modernization, they are looking around and they're trying to gather up ideas, and they accept everything a lot of times with quite open arms. And some of it they Nipponize, they Japanify things, but make it applicable to the Japanese context. But in a lot of other cases, they just take things whole cloth and apply them to themselves, and that entails quite a lot of essentially liberal propaganda, like all the kind of stuff that the libs of the late 19th century were saying is translated over almost whole cloth to Japan. But the reason that we don't remember this tradition as much is because when the alliance breaks down, that is a critical repudiation of these kinds of people who bought into that worldview. And even more so, you could perhaps say, well, a big factor that leads them there as well. So I guess they get two strikes in quick succession. So first there's Versailles, and at Versailles they make an appeal to add into the Treaty of the Versailles, or the League of I can't remember if it was the Treaty of Versailles or the founding of the League of Nations, where it was a
non-racial bias thing, wasn't it?
Yes. So they try to add in a clause which repudiates any kind of like racial hierarchy or anything, and talk about the the equality of the races, and that is shot down by all the Western powers, all the European powers, and America. And so,
although America, of course, didn't join the League of Nations, famously.
No, yeah, well, that's a different story. But essentially, this is treated as a wake up call of sorts, or a complete repudiation of the liberal worldview in Japan. And so, all of the people who are saying, yes, look at all these texts, these Europeans, they play by these rules, these very liberal rules. And so, if we follow the same kind of course and go along with their ideas, their very liberal ideas, then we'll be accepted into the club and we'll be treated as an equal. And then that moment is again, it's a repudiation of that worldview, and these people are heavily delegitimized and basically silenced. And then a lot of the same kind of people are hit again in 1922 when the Anglo-Japanese Treaty is. I'm using the word repudiated too much, but it's the one that comes to mind.
It's the right word. It's the right word.
Yeah. And so again, these people who represented a more diplomatic and liberal view within both the armed forces and also the civilian government are completely silenced, because any figure who is saying Japan overall, the Europeans will not accept us. We need to strike it out on our own and try to create, act much more aggressively on the international stage, because force is the only thing that's going to secure our position. Those people are given all of the ammunition that they need, and we kind of see a little bit more of where that leads later on.
100%. I mean, look, you've also got to see that at the same time that you've got to be careful when you say liberal, because the Anglo-Japanese treaty was really a conservative treaty. It was the only one the Conservative Party did, actually, just after the Anglo-Boer War. And the people who supported the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance were mostly conservatives, including like senior officers in the Royal Navy, etc.
I should say I'm talking very strictly about the Japanese context, because I'm talking about kinds of people, like there were schisms inside a lot of these secret societies, like in the Black Dragon Society in particular, it's quite surprising in a sense, because we remember them as being highly nationalistic and very right wing. But they did have a schism in, I believe it was 1910, something like that, over the annexation of Korea. And the reason being, there was a lot of people who very earnestly bought into the Pan-Asianism in a very liberal sense, and they were very angry about the fact that the Koreans were not being treated as an equal partner in the Union.
Well, for example, in the Anglo-Japanese Alliance was renegotiated at least twice, I believe. And on one occasion, 1911 was one occasion when it was. And in that renegotiation, Britain took less interest in Korea, because it was obviously becoming a firmly Japanese sphere of influence. And that was acknowledged in the treaty, that Britain said, look, basically Korea is a Japanese sphere of influence, which is the way things used to work in those days, of course. But whereas obviously the area around Hong Kong, for example, would be a British sphere of influence. It kind of was acknowledged at the time that the alliance was it was changing a bit. But you've also got to remember that, you had senior Japanese naval officers and even cadets going across to the UK and visiting Royal Navy establishments and shipyards and so on. And you would also have King Edward and later on King George giving Japanese officers British medals, British orders.
Yeah.
Because they'd helped the alliance in some way or another. Or in the First World War, of course, some of them got British gallantry and efficiency medals as well, because they were in the alliance. So at that stage, the Japanese were basically treated exactly the same as, say, the French would have been, or later on the Americans. In fact, I think actually the Brits were fonder of the Japanese than they were the Americans, for probably very good reasons.
Yeah, at this point, and even into World War II, there was quite a lot of animosity among certain individuals, and you can't obviously discount that as a factor in these kinds of negotiations.
No, 100%, 100%. So that's kind of stuff was going on, but I mean, as you say, like the liberal side of Japan, fair enough. I'd probably say I'd probably use nationalist more, but I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, no, so I'm talking about the kind of people who would read, actual capital L liberal texts in the Western tradition and take those ideas seriously and accept them wholeheartedly in terms of like rules based order and equality for all and individual freedoms and all that kind of stuff.
All that kind of stuff that we want to get rid of these days, or a lot of it anyway. In my case, certainly the rules based order. But yeah, I much prefer the old spheres of influence and what you've got the power to hold, you can hold. Myself, I think that's more realistic.
Yeah, ideally, but well, that's a different conversation.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, I think, as I said, I think the Japanese alliance with Britain was actually a pretty natural alliance. It was mostly naval. I mean, I've called it in the title of this the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. It was actually an Anglo-Japanese alliance, but it was almost always referred to as a naval alliance because it basically was.
Yeah.
No one was talking about putting big armies anywhere.
Well, the Japanese are eventually. I mean, that's after the scope of the. No, it does sort of come around when. Well,
I mean, they used a fairly big army against the Russians.
Yeah, not only that, but they make the same kind of mistake as Britain at certain points in tying themselves to the Chinese mainland through Kwantung, formerly Port Arthur, and then Korea as well, and they're gradually sort of making inroads into Manchuria. That kind of really comes to full fruition, I think, after the ending of the.
That's when the Japanese create Manchukuo, isn't it?
Yeah,
with the ex-Chinese emperor as the titular head.
Yes, exactly. But they had actually had other supporters. So there was a couple of Qing princes and I think one princess as well who were quite pro-Japanese even before the formal ending of the Qing Empire, I believe, or the formal fall.
And of course, Japan and Korea had a very long and sometimes troubled history. Like they'd fought wars in even medieval times, I believe.
Yes, there was a fairly famous invasion in the Sengoku Jidai period by Toyotomi Hideyoshi.
Mm-hmm.
After he got all of the daimyo and the samurai on the same page and decided to use all that military might to try and conquer China, but that part's forgotten because he didn't even get as far as taking over Korea.
Yeah, I mean, the big populations in that part of the world.
Yeah.
But so they had a long history. And of course, Taiwan, which is another currently quite interesting place that Japan has repeatedly said they will fight to defend, by the way. Reasonable Japanese political figures have turned around and said that Japan will fight if China attacks Taiwan, partly because the Japanese know damn well that if China does take Taiwan, they're going to be next, because the Chinese hate and detest the Japanese, by and large. So Japan took over Taiwan fairly early on. What was it? Sometime in the 1890s, I believe.
Yeah, 1895. It's one of the one of the terms of the resolution of the first Sino-Japanese War. They take what becomes Port Arthur, but they're forced to give that up to Russia. They take the island of Formosa, Taiwan. I think the Japanese have their own name for it as well. And they exact a lot of reparations, as well as forcing China to give up any claim on Korea.
Yeah, and at the same time, they're also taking over places like, what's that pretty big island, tropical island, which is still Japanese, but the Americans have huge bases there these days because of World War II.
Okinawa?
Okinawa, they take over that round about that kind of period, I believe.
A little bit earlier, I think.
Maybe 1880s, something like around there.
It's one of their very early, one of the early Imperial Japanese acquisitions, I believe.
Yeah. There's a lot of little islands around Japan, which basically they spread out to gradually before they start their bigger stuff in Korea and Taiwan, as we were saying, and all this kind of stuff. Biaki says Okinawa has its own cute little wild jungle cat. I can well believe that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'll have to have a quick look at and see if I can see one of those. Never heard of that.
Yeah, I know it's quite a popular holiday destination for Japanese these days because it's tropical.
Popular destination among the Japanese?
Yes, I believe quite a lot of Japanese go to Okinawa, don't they? I follow a few Japanese channels just because I find Japanese culture very interesting, which is one reason I wanted to do this stream. And quite a lot of them go to Okinawa because it's tropical, although there are mixed feelings about the big American base there these days.
Yeah, well, that's an issue all its own. There's all sorts of crimes that are committed by the local Marines, and the Japanese can't actually prosecute them.
Yeah, which I can imagine would be extremely annoying.
Yeah.
There you go. It's called the Iramote cat, apparently.
Yeah. I just found them. They do look quite interesting.
Cool. I'll have to go and look that up myself after the stream. I'm quite interested in wildlife and so on. But yeah, so all of that stuff. And as I said, the ending of the Anglo-Japanese agreement was basically forced by the Americans. And it was basically forced because the Royal Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy together had a significant advantage over the American Navy.
Yeah. Like I said, it seems to me to be at least largely financial in nature, in that the Brits were trying to. They seem to have been trying to get some kind of like loan forgiveness, which obviously never even plays out. It's not made explicit that that will be a term of the ending of the treaty. So potentially there were other justifications that were used, which I haven't necessarily entirely found, other than just picking a side in the Pacific context, trying to back the winning team, kind of. But
I've always thought the whole Washington Naval Treaty was a mistake for Britain. Britain wasn't bankrupt after World War One, not in the same way she was after World War Two, when she absolutely was bankrupt, which is a different story, of course. But after World War One, Britain was nowhere near bankrupt. Britain was paying off her debts and had a surplus for most of the time. It got a little bit bad in the 30s because of the Great Depression, but Britain was still not as skint as most other nations were.
And also launched back into economic growth much more confidently than the rest of the world.
Yes,
thanks to
absolutely.
The Imperial tariff policy.
Yes, absolutely. And also, look at some of those lovely 1930s houses, which most people know, at least in the southeast part of Britain, which were built in the 1930s, which are really popular houses because they're so much better than the ones that are built today. But Britain wasn't doing so badly financially after World War One, and we had a plan to deal with America trying to build more warships. And had we not ditched all our own earlier warships, and we carried on with this plan, which was to build the 4 biggest, most powerful battle cruisers in the world and the 4 biggest, most powerful battleships in the world, the Americans would have found it very difficult to deal with that.
So do you know why they backed away from that idea?
No, I don't. Well, I have some ideas, but you tell me what you know, Rupert, please.
No. I this is more or less the first I'm hearing of this. So,
basically, the government didn't want to spend the money. It was as simple as that. They just didn't want to spend the money.
Yeah, that's what I would guess.
They had the money. They could have afforded it, but they didn't want to do it. Had they done so, they would have ended up with 4 18-inch gun battleships in the 1920s. Like, that's the same size as the 2 giant Japanese battleships in World War II, which were the only 18-inch gun battleships ever built. And they would have ended up with 4 very fast 16-inch gun armed battle cruisers. And the Americans had nothing on the boards that could have possibly coped with any of those. And also, the American Congress probably would have said, no, we're not going to spend this amount of money. Sorry.
Yeah. One does
Because
wonder.
the chances of Britain attacking America were like virtually zero. And most Americans knew that.
Yeah.
But basically, Britain gave up her naval dominance after World War One at the Washington Naval Treaty, and at the same time, of course, we abrogated the Anglo-Japanese Treaty.
Yeah. I mean, well, just to make clear for anyone unaware, if it's not already obvious, the British were the ones to actually end the treaty, but
yeah, the Japanese found that shameful.
Yeah, but it was done under some great distress, at least insofar as the people who are actually signing the treaty and formalizing everything. It sounds like quite a grim scene with the Japanese and British both looking quite.
The Royal Navy were extremely unhappy with it. They didn't like it at all, but they didn't like anything about the Washington Naval Treaty. Quite rightly.
As were the Japanese Navy, and a lot of these factions who were pro-British and pro-Western, they saw this as a complete justification of the more hardline nationalist position of Japan's basically on its own and needs to craft its own worldview for like a new situation in Asia.
This is when they came out with the bullshit of the Far East co-prosperity sphere and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, the idea had been floating around for a lot longer, but it was not something which took the form that we know it as until later. So that it was still sort of open as to whether or not this could be something that's probably, you could say more closer to like an Asian EU or something.
Although, of course, in the event in World War II, it didn't turn out to be that at all. It was just all these nations were being exploited for the Japanese. But, far more than the British Empire ever was, by the way.
Yeah, it became a mechanism for almost just administering occupied territories, really. And trying to set up puppet governments that would subsequently take power. So I believe there was an Indian representative, for example, before India was really brought under Japanese power or suzerainty.
Well, the India was you're talking about the Indian National Army under Bose.
Yes.
And what the Indian, as well as the British soldiers, called the Indian Traitor Army in World War II, and who they didn't often take prisoner.
Yes.
Which you are not supposed to talk about, but they didn't. And these days, after independence in India in 1947, these guys were lionized, even though they were regarded as traitors by the vast majority of the soldiers who fought for India against Japan. So anyway, there we go.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Bjarki in the chat is trying to tell me about Okinawa and films about the Yakuza set on Okinawa, and I'm pretty sure I've seen that film, and it ain't bad. I'm fairly sure I've watched a lot of Japanese movies. I like Japanese historical movies. Although that isn't a historical movie. It's like set in the 70s or something. But I like Japanese historical samurai movies and so on. And I watch more Japanese movies these days because unlike the Western movies, they're not all woke, in inverted commas, and lefty and all about LGBTQ people, women and black people, which is the only things you're allowed to make films about in the West these days.
Yeah, sadly.
Absolutely, sadly, yeah. But yeah, the Japanese Naval Treaty actually served Britain very well. I think it served Japan pretty well during the period it was in force.
Yeah, I mean, Japan did get what it wanted out of the situation mostly. They wanted to be legitimized, and they were legitimized.
And Britain got the same. And I mean, can you ask much more from a treaty, really?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that it came into force during World War One, Japan got more or less all of the territorial concessions that they wanted, and Britain got what they wanted, which was protection of her existing territories.
Yeah, Japan got quite a lot of islands and so on after the end of the First World War, which were former German possessions for the most part.
Yeah. The only sort of sour part was, and this comes as much from America as Britain and the rest of the Entente powers of the time, is when the Russian Revolution breaks out, Japan is part of the international coalition of Entente forces to try to stabilize the situation in favor of the whites and intervene in expeditionary forces. But because Japan is the power that is least fatigued by the war and the least, has the most available manpower to dedicate to it, they end up throwing themselves into, protecting Vladivostok and the white forces there. Much more so than any other power, and for much longer.
Didn't you say, Rupert, on the stream you did with Simi ago, that the Japanese even had a plan to rescue the Tsar and his family at one stage?
Yes, and there were several such plans that existed. I think it was 4. I saw plans to try to rescue the Tsar and his family when they were in captivity, but obviously none of them were carried out or attempted to our knowledge. And Japan was involved in some way with most of them, I think, but the details are not necessarily known, other than the one that they were going to lead, because they had existing trade missions and outposts, basically, of either outright Imperial Japanese officers or supporters, civilian supporters in one of the secret societies or another, who were just around and able to be activated as an asset in this operation.
No, that's it. That's interesting. It's a pity they didn't manage that, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very romantic reason as to why they felt like they ought to do it as well, because obviously after the animosity, which, as we were talking about, formed some of the basis of the original alliance, Anglo-Japanese Alliance, after 1905, 1906, there's actually a surprising amount of cordiality between the Japanese and the Russians. They actually make up quite quickly and get back on the same page. And so from that angle,
and they both have an emperor, of course.
Yeah. So that is part of it. That the aristocracies of both countries are quite friendly with one another and much more. Well, put it this way: the Japanese are quite a bit more in line with Russian thought than they are with, say, French thought on issues of politics.
Absolutely right.
But also in, I think it was in 1890, 91, something like that, there was an assassination attempt against, at the time, Tsarevich Nicholas. That's quite an interesting anecdote in its own way, because it's a policeman who attacks the Tsarevich, the later Nicholas II, with a sword. Tries to kill him, but he's protected by I think it was Prince George, the Prince of Wales at the time, because they were traveling together, and he defends and fights off this would-be assassin with a walking stick. But
cool.
Sorry.
Cool.
Yeah. But thereafter, Nicholas still has a scar on his, I think it's on his forehead or something, that he keeps. And has with him for the rest of his life. But also, so on the basis of this, the Japanese government is very embarrassed, obviously, on the official level, even at the time. But thereafter, they sort of feel a little bit guilty about it, and so they kind of see it as a way to recover their honor, as it were.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, that makes sense. Look, a couple of points to finish up. One thing I found interesting about your stream on Japanese intelligence was, having read quite a lot about the opening of World War II in Malaya and Singapore and all this kind of stuff, and also Hong Kong, it was certainly noted that there were loads of Japanese barbers and Japanese tour guides and people who went around with cameras photographing military installations all over the place. The British intelligence even noted that, like, pretty strongly before World War II, which I think ties in very much with what you were talking about with Semi ago.
Yeah, there's one other detail about that I didn't mention, but it's quite relevant here, is that the the organization that they found it hardest to gather information on, especially in an informal capacity. So the one that was kind of most airtight, even at the start, even from the start, was actually the British Navy.
Yeah, I can believe that. And yet the British Navy, as I said earlier, used to allow Japanese officers and even Japanese cadets to go and visit facilities and all this kind of stuff during the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. Josephina Herigway in the chat has asked, can you put up the name of the channel that you did that thing on with Japanese espionage? It was Semi-Agog's channel, I know this.
Yes.
If you got the link, Rupert, maybe you can stick it in the chat. Or
I'm
if
just
not,
right now, yeah.
stick it in the private chat and I'll put it up if you can't. It's a very good stream. Do go and watch it. The other thing I would say is that quite often people will say that the Brits underestimated the Japanese in World War II. And in terms of the Royal Navy in particular, I don't think that's true at all because of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. I don't think the Royal Navy underestimated them at all. And people will talk about the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, for example. The Royal Navy didn't want to send Prince of Wales and Repulse to Singapore. That was Winston Churchill entirely, who overruled his naval advisors, who told him not to do it. And even when he was going to do it originally, there was going to be an aircraft carrier with them that would have probably broken up those Japanese torpedo bomber attacks. But when that carrier ran aground and couldn't go, Churchill still insisted on sending the two capital ships.
Yeah.
But that was entirely down to Churchill, who, if you look at most British naval disasters between 1914 and 1945, you'll find almost all of them. If you follow them right down to their bottom, you'll find Winston Churchill. Almost always. Hardly an exception.
I'm reminded of another anecdote about the response to the Blitz, where at one point, because they didn't have enough anti-aircraft guns, they decided to just take old artillery pieces and aim them at the sky, and that ended up causing potentially more casualties than the actual bombs dropped by the Luftwaffe themselves. So I wonder if it's more of the something must be done attitude rather than actually trying to do what is going to be effective.
Oh, look, my father, who was born in 1933, in World War II, used to collect shrapnel. And I saw some of the shrapnel that he collected, like donkey's years after World War II. And most of it was British artillery shells. It wasn't bits of German bombs. So, yeah, absolutely. Totally true. But, yeah, Josephina Herringway, just go and check out Semi-Agog. Hang on,
I did just post the link, but it doesn't seem to have made it through.
All right, stick it in the private chat, mate, and I'll copy it onto the. You probably don't have permission to do it. I'll change that, but it's not easy to do now, I don't think. But if you stick it in private chat, I'll put it into the actual chat. There you go. There you go. There's the link, guys. So yeah, do go and see that. It's very good. I've got to plug a couple of things before we finish. Did you have any final points you wanted to make, Rupert? I'm conscious that you said you're not very well and you wanted to keep this stream under an hour and a half. So did you have any particular things you wanted to finish? Sorry, you like final thoughts or anything like that?
No, I don't think so. I think we pretty much covered everything that I wanted to. I mean, the main point is just kind of, again, illustrating all of these different factions that existed within the Japanese armed forces and how, how much of a ripple effect it has essentially in also in wider Japanese society. The complete, again, repudiation of acceptance by the West and by Britain, and kind of just pushes them into the arms of the nationalists who want to basically just burn down all of the European empires around them and attack and cannibalize whatever they can.
Kind of sued the Americans, really, as well, if you look at it that way.
In the end, yeah, they did, but
purely coincidence, of course. as Semyagog would say, purely coincidence. Although he likes to say that about the British. But anyway, yeah. I want to plug a couple of things. First of all, do go and see a stream, which I think was yesterday, on Nathan C.J. Hood's channel with Rupert August and a couple of other excellent guests about St. George, because of course it was St. George's Day, England's National Day. That was an excellent stream, Rupert. I think that's one of the reasons you're not feeling so good now. You've just done so much talking over the last few days.
I think that's really not helped. Yeah, I've been a little bit ill as is, but yeah, on the Semyagog one is about 3 hours of constant talking, and then there was there was the St. George's Day stream as well. So yeah, that's really
over 3 hours. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I can believe that. But it was an excellent stream. It really is well worth going to watch, particularly if you're British or Anglo-Celtic. The other one I want to give a plug to is I did not a stream. I did a video with Horace. We were like chatting, and like Horace has now edited it and put it out on. Let me go and check. Where has he put it out? Work out where Horace's streams are these days. Under Shilling in my channel. Let me go and find it so I can give a link. Boom, boom, boom. It's called The Last 1,000 Days of the British Empire, and it's on Odyssey. And it's me and Horace talking about the last 1,000 days of the British Empire, which is basically the middle of World War II onwards, under the fabulous guidance of Winston Churchill, which did so much to extend the British Empire. And yes, I am taking this. And you can go and look at that, at this place here. Go and check that stream out. And then I know Apostolic Majesty is doing a stream tomorrow, I think, on Winston Churchill and Stalin. And I'm going to be doing a stream on this channel with Apostolic Majesty on the next Sunday, which is going to be looking at Anglo-Soviet relations in World War II, which is going to be a bit like this stream in some respects.
Sounds like a good one. I'll definitely have to check that one out.
Yeah, it should be. I've wanted to get AM on a stream for ages, obviously, because like you've done stuff with AM. I know, Rupert.
No, I haven't actually.
I thought you had.
It seems like a natural pairing, but I haven't. No.
Oh, okay. Well, well, I mean, he's on our Discord, so you can get hold of him quite easily. So yeah, I mean, you should, because yeah, you and AM would go quite well on a stream together. I mean, like AM does stuff with people like Semyagog, etc. So yeah, I think you'd go very well on that sort of thing. But yeah, do go and check them out. I don't think we got any super chats, so I will have a quick check. Probably don't think we did. Oh, we did actually. Sorry. Beg your pardon. Darth Kilhoon for US $3 is saying, going to the NCO Academy soon for a month-long leadership course to advance to the rank of sergeant. It's completely unrelated, but I'm sure it jogs Iron Duke's memory in the British Army, although I'm US. It doesn't really, because that's not the way it used to work in the British Army. Your initial promotions to like Lance Corporal and Corporal didn't require anything. Going to Sergeant, as far as I understand, back in my day, you could still get that from your usually company officer's recommendation, and the CO would okay it, but you would have to pass certain courses. So yeah, you would have to you would have to pass certain courses, but we didn't have an NCO school really back in my day anyway. British Army may well do these days, because the British Army these days is full of women, and women like schools. They don't like just you learn your job and then you go and do it. They don't like that stuff. They like everything to be like female, basically.
Nonetheless, good luck, and hope it all goes well.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I do hope it goes well. My son is serving in the British Armed Forces at the moment as an officer. I have to say I struggle to say that people should do that anymore. I really do. I struggle to think people should do that anymore, because what are you fighting for? You got to look what you're fighting for. I perfectly understand someone back in the 1890s fighting for their country. I perfectly understand someone doing it in the 1920s. I even perfectly understand someone doing it like when I joined the British Army in 1983. Britain was still just about Britain in 1983. We just fought the Falklands War, for God's sake. Now, guys were getting killed and maimed in Afghanistan and Iraq to spread LGBTQ stuff and to get Muslim women educated in feminism. I mean, is that worth dying for? Not to me.
Well, at the very least, hopefully the skills come in handy. So
yes, that's just what I was going to say, Rupert. Like, people on our side, and the funny thing is, like, a lot of people on our side have already done this, because the military used to be basically pretty right wing. We've kind of even spoken about this in relation to the British side of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Agreement. They were mostly pretty conservative nationalist figures on the British side. And you have loads of veterans. Absolutely, I understand that there are loads of military veterans in America and Britain and Australia and Canada and all over the place who are basically traditional right-wing kinds of blokes. But the leadership of our military these days is not. It just isn't. I'm sorry. You'll have British admirals coming on the Forces News, which is one of the most left-wing channels on YouTube. It's British Forces News, run by the Ministry of Defence, paid for by British taxpayers, and all it goes on about 90% of the time is LGBTQ, feminism, and diversity. That's all it goes on about. Nothing else. Like, everything not about the British forces, really, traditionally. I'm I have issues with the modern Western military and Ukraine, for example. Like, I don't support Ukraine. Ukraine's fighting for LGBTQ rights, as far as I'm aware, more than anything else. But I mean, that's just me. Other people may not agree. There we are. Where can people find you, Rupert?
Well, I'm in a few places, so a good bet would be to Google my name and check anything that piques your interest. I write on Praxarchy. I do have some videos on YouTube. I want to get back to it at some point. I just haven't got around to it yet. But I'm on a bunch of streams. And I'm sure there's at least something else. Oh, on Twitter as well. Yeah, I've got some good threads on Twitter.
Yeah, cool, man. Look, absolutely. You've been on my stream a fair number of times, and you are always most welcome, because you're a very intelligent and well-read chap. So, and thank you so much for joining me on this stream, particularly when you weren't feeling tip-top. So, thanks for that, man.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Always welcome. Anytime you want. Okay, guys. I will be back on Saturday with Saturday UK time, early hours of Sunday morning, Eastern Australian time, with Splendid Isolation. And go well. Take care. And don't let the bastards grind you down. And before I leave, I'm going to play us out with a tune. Okay. And that, of course, was Hearts of Oak, which is the March of the Royal Navy and has been for many, many years. Biaki saying Happy Anzac Day for tomorrow. I might even do a stream for Anzac Day, Biaki. We'll see. If I can get a couple of Aussies to come on with me, I might even do a stream for that. I am trying to do 2 streams a week at the moment. It's not totally working out, but I'm getting there. I am getting there. But it's harder than some people think to organize streams for people because, you've both got to be free. And like I'm down south, down under, although I'm an Englishman who lives down under. And like, if I'm going to do a stream with Rupert here, Rupert is probably about 10:30, probably about 8:30 at night, I think, in UK.
Yep.
And I'm 5:33 a.m. on Tuesday. So this stream started at 4 o'clock in the morning for me. So it's harder than you think to do that stuff. But anyway, we will keep trying. Thank you very much, Rupert, for joining me and being a most interesting guest who knows far more about some of this stuff than I do. And I hope to have you on a stream again soon. And people in the chat, go well. Thank you for the chap who sent us a super chat. I hope your sergeant's course goes really well. And we'll see you soon. Go well.
Thanks and good night, all.